Welcome to the new season of our podcast, The Bold Truth About Hungary. This time, before the kickoff of the political season here in Hungary, we decided that we're going to start with some analytical issues. And I wanted to introduce to you Lóránt Sümeghi, who's a chief senior analyst of Századvég, one of our major background institutions who are dealing with polls and all kinds of research in many fields for the past over a decade. I believe we are going to have a meaningful conversation today on European issues. First, I would like him actually to introduce, according to our principle, and that is, we always say what we mean and we always mean what we say, and that is head-on, promptly addressing issues about the methodology they decided about to commence 7 years ago on a Europe-wide polling on certain issues. The main target, the main reason behind that research was what we have basically found out during the first period of the new Hungarian government after 2010, and namely that on European issues, the mainstream Western European media and Western European political parties are basically running narratives and are having topics which has not much to do actually with reality on the ground. While in Hungary, we have decided back in 2010, if you recall our previous conversations, that we're going to deal with issues that are embedded in society, that have a major interest among Hungarians, the Hungarian society, and very obviously are connected to reality on the ground, because good policy making and good political decisions are based on one first principle, and that is knowledge of reality on the ground. Please.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be able to speak about this comprehensive research which Századvég has carried out throughout Europe, involving 38,000 respondents for now in the past 7 years. One of the main focuses on why Project Europe was constructed by the foundation was exactly what, as you mentioned, European citizens and Hungarian citizens' opinion usually has a very big divide between the European elite's opinion on how to lead Europe and on major issues. Thus, Project Europe's main focuses was to be able to examine the opinion of European citizens on major issues which form Europe's future and which form Europe's present issues also and challenges. Therefore, it is a groundbreaking study which Századvég has conducted and will hopefully conduct for the future years to come.
If I may come in just for a second, then let's emphasize that it's a completely representative.
Absolutely.
And that is, it is following a methodology by which you can extrapolate basically the numbers and the results as of testifying about public opinion and the public sentiment on certain issues nationwide in certain European countries.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, more than 38,000 people have been involved. The aggregated results are weighted by the individual country's population. This is a methodology which we rarely see across Europe. A lot of Western European or transatlantic think tanks usually conduct research mainly based upon perception or sometimes, as you mentioned, artificially built narratives. But we at Századvég focus on being in very close connection to reality and the truths of our everydays.
Before coming into the details, let's emphasize here that there's one instance actually we've just bumped into a couple of days ago, and that is Transparency International's so-called corruption, as they say, which has nothing to do with representativeness, and that is neither the figures nor the methodology, country by country, can be even compared. So the value of what we are going to talk here is again resting on and is based on the methodology itself.
absolutely. And I hope that I can provide you with some interesting conclusions and data. So if we dive into the details a bit, the main focuses of Project Europe are always, as I mentioned, upon issues which are forming the future and present of Europe. Therefore, it goes without saying that in the past years, the big crises which were affecting Europe, such as the migration crisis or the pandemic, or the coronavirus pandemic, were also an integral part of our research. However, this year's research has obviously been formulated around, unfortunately, the raging war in our neighborhood mostly. But on the other hand, it goes without saying that our research did not leave out very important topics such as public opinions on the performance of the EU and its institutions, basic policy issues such as family and demography. So I really think that this year's Project Europe still has been able to maintain its overarching outlook.
And that is that it continues on the topics actually that were with us for the past 7 years, basically, behind us.
Yes.
It obviously is reflecting on the reality and the novelties and the unfortunate turns in European political and geostrategical terms. All right.
So if I may start with the age-old question of, if we look at public opinion and public perception over the idea of whether our European Union should go in the direction of a more federalist idea or a more sovereignist idea. We do hear a lot of reports coming from the mainstream media or from some Western politicians' rhetorics that the European Union should move in a federalist direction, and that is what the European citizens would like. Unfortunately, our research shows that these reports are false. Only a handful of countries would like to prefer the federalist direction for Europe. Much more of the member states would prefer to have more power over Brussels and not the other way around, which goes totally against the perception which mainstream media outlets are trying to portray for us today. And if we're generally speaking about this phenomena, it's very important to say that the biggest question that forms and divides Europe today are the sanctions given in the context of the war deriving from Brussels. And as I mentioned in my previous sentences, the media's reports and the Western European politicians' false reports about the idea of which way Europe should basically head, we can see the same pattern emerging regarding sanctions policy. Most of the countries are not satisfied with how Brussels' sanction policies are panning out, and this is also contrary to what public opinion is spread by artificial narratives and mainly politicians coming from Brussels.
Well, you will be able to take a closer look actually to these charts as we are going to project it in the background during the conversation. But certainly these were two main aspects actually of the methodology. We are going to come back in detail later. That the major agent provocateur, let's put it that way, in this field is obviously the European Parliament and the very loud and the provocative heads who are talking continuously about a projection of future or the ideas about Europe actually in a completely different way, as we are going to see. That is the public sentiment in Europe. And also, what is very, very telling is how the Commission, on the other hand, while preparing for novel sanctions and new escalatory steps against Russia, is disregarding the public sentiment in Europe. Because together with the European Parliament, as a matter of fact, they do have the impetus actually to influence politics and policy making in a way which is going to contradict public sentiment. But before we come back, let's start step by step with the, if you like, the traditional elements of the analysis, and that is family and those traditional values on which we have a very firm and unrelenting stance actually from the very beginning of our government, dating back to 2010.
Yes, I think it's safe to say that the whole issue of the importance of family, and I have to add that it connects with the issue of maintaining our Christian culture, our traditions. This issue emerged in its importance, especially after 2015, the migration crisis hit Europe. That's when European citizens and European politicians faced the issue of the very grave dangers of demography and declining demography in Europe. And the Hungarian government's standpoint on these issues were criticized quite a lot, and are still criticized up to this day on its standpoint of preferring to maintain the protection of families instead of migrants or foreign individuals coming to Europe. But as our research shows, the Hungarian government's standpoint is much more mainstream among European citizens than it is spoken of as in Brussels. If we look at the chart of all the EU countries average on what they think is more important issue for their government, for example, whether the protection of families, the support of families, or helping couples who would like to have children in the future, versus the argument of protecting and offering, for example, more support to LGBT communities or foreign individuals who would come to Europe. The EU average shows that there's a majority in regarding the stance of the protection of families and the importance of families. So I think what's very important to talk about is the general sentiment in Europe is absolutely pro-family. There is no question about that. But it's a very interesting question why the political elite of Brussels does not want to take this into account, and why it disregards this argument constantly. And if we're talking about family, I think it's very important to reflect upon new happenings which have basically come from the transatlantic region, from the United States of America, but are now quite mainstream in the western parts of Europe.
Yeah, we talk about the so-called woke culture, the cancel culture.
Yes, the woke culture, the cancel culture, and a certain kind of more passive-aggressive spreading of the LGBTQ ideologies. And it's very interesting that these issues have become an agenda to be able to portray for minors too, for under 10-year-old children too. And for example, the Hungarian standpoint on this issue is very, very stable and has been articulated for more than years now. And if we look at Europe and then the member states of Europe, I have to say that our research shows that this is quite a mainstream issue too. A lot of countries, the majority of countries, share the opinion that children under 10 years old should not be exposed to LGBTQ agenda, to sex education, and reforming the educational system in order to accommodate these kind of new waves and new comings of basically the Western society.
It's rather interesting if you take a look at the charts, and we are going to project it for you, that you can also see the entire poll actually at our website and on Twitter, that certainly there's a visible regional divide between Western Europe, if you like, and Central Europe. But at the end, if we take a look at the slide number 12, it's going to show you that this is overwhelming opinion on behalf of Europeans, that the traditional family, and together with that, protecting minors, and that is kids under the age of 16, 18, is a priority. And that is those international rules actually that are in place together should be observed in face of the LGBTQ community's push for new methodologies and something, a new value system that should be introduced.
Absolutely, and if I might add, it becomes quite clear that when the respondents are faced with the question of deciding between what is more, what should have a more priority in regards of government's agenda, the protection of families versus the protection of the LGBTQ communities and forwarding their rights, then we can see an overarching majority in Europe. So when the citizens are faced with a firm decision, there is absolutely no question of what they think is more important and what should be dealt with.
That is itself is very interesting and telling actually, that in face of those not years but rather decades old pushes that are coming from the political left, who are trying to thematize and reconstruct actually the narratives, the major narratives on Europe, how those things proceed, and still sticking to maintaining devotion to the traditional value system of Europe is there, unquestionably there. But very obviously, these intended major topics like the LGBTQ campaign we've seen for the past couple of years are being overshadowed by this very unfortunate armed conflict, the war in Ukraine following Russian aggression. But it's going to be telling, not telling you the secret ahead, that even on the war and relating topics, we are going to find something completely different in European public opinion than what you see in the Western European mainstream, so-called liberal, independent, self-confessedly independent, but rather tendentious European press. Tell us something about how public opinion relates to the war according to the poll.
Yes, when unfortunately this war broke out, the European continent seemed to be united in the notion of protecting whatever ideology they thought would have to be protected, and the rhetorics coming from Brussels were very hawkish. They were very committed to step up and impose very hard-hitting sanctions against Russia, and the whole rhetoric of Brussels was, as I just said, very hawkish, very sudden. But the Hungarian government was much more careful on addressing this issue and was siding with a much more humanitarian perspective of this whole issue. And what we see in our polls is that time and time again, the Hungarian government's standpoint proves to be just a bit more mainstream than it is portrayed.
Let's make it completely clear that the Hungarian government, basically the next day, and that is the second day after the eruption of the war and the invasion of Ukraine, have made stance by peace, and we can very certainly say that this is the only unchanging attitude actually, or governmental perspective on what is happening right from the very beginning. So don't question the Hungarian government on changing sides and shifting. We are the fixed point actually on the European political chart if regarding the attitude toward the war. And we are going to see that while the European leadership, including some national leaderships, are shifting towards more and more weapon supplies, basically towards the escalation of the war. In face of that, the Hungarian position is very firm. And that's what is going to make it interesting how the citizens of Europe opine about the war and the
Absolutely. When the Hungarian government formulated its opinion formulated a pro-peace opinion, and is keeping this stance to this day, and it will probably keep its stance for the forthcoming months and years until this tragic conflict will end. it's very important to say that the Hungarian opinion was made to be somewhat of a black sheep within the European community and was criticized heavily, that it does not reflect the European sentiment, and Brussels criticized the Hungarian government of following its own ideas and going against the European sentiment. But our research shows that the only country within Europe which has basically mirrored exactly the European citizens' sentiment and feelings about this war is Hungary. That is the only country.
Very certainly the Hungarian public opinion's attitude towards what is happening in our neighbor is known right from the beginning. As a matter of fact, just for the viewers and listeners, let us remind them that it all started before the general elections of last year, the beginning of April. So we had almost 2 months, a month and a half actually, during the war when the campaign was going on. So the Hungarian government, if you like, the Hungarian center-right's attitude towards is very clear. Then that is, we stand by peace and we go for immediate ceasefire and peace talks. And that is completely resonating with the Hungarian population. But the most astonishing thing is that as we take a look at these numbers and aspects of your questions, that basically goes for the entire European public opinion.
Absolutely. Last year we had a general election, as you mentioned, and cynically speaking, we could call that as the greatest opinion poll in Hungary on regarding this issue, on what political force should be in charge of our country. And the Hungarian people, in a huge majority, chose the Hungarian government's pro-peace stance over our opposition's quite probably ununderstandably hawkish position. But as you mentioned, if we look at the chart number 15, we can see major European countries, and we're talking about influential powerhouse countries, which show that the governments, the individual member states' governments, have not mirrored, reflected their voters' opinion when it comes to dealing with the war. And I'd like to point out, for example, Germany, where there is a huge divide between the German electorate's opinion on how Germany should conduct itself during this conflict and how the German political elite is actually conducting itself. It's inevitable to mention that the German population is much more pro-peace than its political elite, and that should cause an alarm to the German and to the European electorate. But the same pattern emerges when we look at Italy, which is also a major country. But if we look at Europe throughout, we see that the majority of countries, except for the Nordic and the Baltic region, which for understandable geopolitical reasons have a different perspective on the issue. But if we look at the major countries and the Central European region, we can see that the Hungarian standpoint is again much more mainstream than it is spoken of in Brussels.
Well, one of the most astonishing things is indeed that in the language, the narrative of European leaders, up to basically we are approaching the first anniversary of the outbreak of the war, you wouldn't find reference to peace. And that is Europe as a peace project is basically not talking about stepping in, as the Prime Minister suggested right at the very beginning. I believe it was maybe the first or the second week, to step in between the warring parties. Yes. And become an intermediate, a mediator who is trying to facilitate peace. Now the charge is actually that who is going for peace is going for the defeat of one of the countries. I believe is wrong. We clearly know that stopping the bloodshed, stepping in and start talking about peace could provide for some meaningful content to come. But the most astonishing thing for me from the charts is probably the willingness or the attitude of the local populations, which come together with what you suggested just before, to fight for their own countries. How is it possible that national governments who are hawkish together with the European leadership disregard the general sentiment of their own population when it's about, first of all, attitude towards the war, and second, the willingness to participate in any kind of armed conflict should it escalate towards a more general armed conflict in Europe.
I think what we see on this chart, where mostly, generally speaking, the big European countries' citizens absolutely do not want to have anything to do with fighting, and they do not want to have anything to do with any kind of war or conflict. This basically shows that the political elite is very, very far off from their own electorate, and the whole sentiment in Europe is absolutely pro-peace. It cannot be stated enough. So, and it's very interesting that when the war broke out, the European leaders articulated their hawkish position and referred to the European citizens' absolute commitment to defend Europe and to be basically actively or inactively, but to get involved in the war, either just rhetorically or with the logistics of arms or the supplies of arms. But as you can see on the chart, the majority of European countries' citizens do not want to have anything to do with fighting for their country or to be implicated in a war.
At the same time, it goes without saying that that's going to be, if you take a look at the next chart actually, if you have time, that the same stands for arms supplies. So in the big upsurge of devotion and going for more and more weapons to Ukraine, that's completely against the public sentiment in most European countries.
Absolutely, and if we step one step back towards the whole issue, I mean, we can understand that the whole history of Europe is basically giving us the picture that Europeans have had enough of bloodshed throughout the decades and throughout the past centuries. But this is something that European leaders do not take in regard. And this is an issue which not just the Hungarian government, but a lot of governments will, I think, start to realize as we go towards the war and how this is going to be a drawn-out war. But I think that most of the countries will start to realize that this is not something which should be taken lightheartedly, and they should listen much more to the European citizens who are absolutely a pro-peace stance.
Apart from the hawkish moralizing attitude of European elites, which completely contradict actually to what most Hungarians and most Europeans think about the prospect of war and participating in it, it's very telling that if we come back and come to particular issues, and that is how obviously war-triggered or the hawkish-triggered sanction policies are regarded, that's going to be very telling that the public sentiment, the perception of the sanction policies, use, necessity, practicality, and outcome is basically questioned by the Europeans.
Yes, if we look at chart number 21, for example, to understand the context of the sanctions, most of the European member states' voters are dissatisfied how their governments have handled the whole economic consequence of the war. And deriving from this issue, we have to talk about Brussels' sanction policy, which first of all promised a huge impact on the Russian economy. It promised that it will end the bloodshed on its own, and it promised that the whole of the European economy will be able to get over this whole conflict in a very short period of time. But what we've actually seen is that neither the member states' governments have dealt very well with this economic impact. And what we are seeing that the sanction policies coming from Brussels have actually made more harm to Europe than to the Russian economy, which is, safe to say, absolutely backfired on the main focal point of the sanctions which were introduced. Well, the first one was introduced now nearly a year ago. So
from these numbers, if I'm right, you can also see that though those statements and analysis that is suggesting that Europe is just basically ruining and sacrificing its competitiveness in face of the war and the sanction policies and what is happening at the energy market, and that is an energy crisis, though that might be regarded abstract and not acknowledgeable by public opinion, they clearly know and clearly see that the sanctions policies are no good, as you suggested, in terms of real economic development, but also the concern is rising that is going to affect basically their everyday life, unemployment, accessibility to workplace, and so on.
Absolutely, and if we're talking about the whole economic crisis which has come from this war, it's very important to mention Europe's competitiveness in the global economy, and also its performance in being able to secure sufficient amount of energy. And if we look at, for example, chart number 23, when we're talking about Europe's performance on being able to weather storms related to energy crisis, we see that all European countries, and I stress all European countries except Hungary, faced a very, very profound scare during this winter, whether they will be able to have sufficient energy to heat their citizens' homes. And when we look at this chart, then this gives us a really tangible example of what grave dangers Europe is facing in this energy crisis, and how much the Russian energy is still an integral part of Europe's energy plan and its economy.
Obviously, we are not foretellers, so we won't be able to tell you what's going to happen, but after giving you just a taste, actually, of the entire poll, which is I believe is worth taking an entire look at in detail, which we are going to provide for. As a senior analyst, what do you think, how long that kind of discrepancy between public opinion, public sentiment, and elitist leadership way approaching the war can be maintained, and what the result is going to be? Very obviously, the poll is going to be repeated this year. As we suggested earlier, this is a year-by-year systematic approach to get to know the European public sentiment on certain issues. Do you believe it's going to effectuate some kind of turn in the member states or in the European institutions?
Unfortunately, I don't consider myself too optimistic on this issue. We have conducted this poll since 2016, and annually, year by year, we see that the divide between the European electorate and the European leaders is unfortunately growing, but it's never too late. And to mention an optimistic idea, if we talk about, for example, the sanctions on the imports of Russian oil in Europe, we can see that apart from Hungary, there are other countries too who have formulated a very heavy disagreement with the sanction policy. These might only be a few countries who don't have a maritime connection and who are heavily independent on Russian energy. But still, we can see that there are some countries which have already realized that a one-size-fits-all sanction policy will not work for a long time in the European Union. And if we consider this as a stepping stone, this might be the catalyst of more countries getting to realize the fact that a more detailed approach is probably needed in order to be able to deal with this war. And my hope is that more and more countries, with the passage of time, will realize that the only and most important standpoint regarding this war is to end the war without any further bloodshed, and to force peace negotiations between the parties as soon as possible.
Lóránt Sümeghi, thank you. I believe this is where we got today. Please continue following us at Twitter and also at our website about Hungary. We are going to come back to these issues and topics time to time, and I believe we are going to have the opportunity with Századvég and you yourself to continue with this analysis. Thank you.